Hey, breaking news we first reported to you right here on Fox 25 this morning. A Suffolk County grand jury handed up an indictment against Aaron Hernandez in the 2012 double murder in Boston. He'll be charged with killing Daniel Abreu and Safiro Furtado. Right now we want to join Suffolk County DA Dan Connolly with details on this indictment. He's now holding this news conference live. Let's listen in.
Suffolk County grand jury returned indictments charging Aaron Hernandez with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the shooting deaths of Daniel Abreu and Safiro Furtado. Mr. Abreu and Mr. Furtado were ambushed and executed as they drove home along Shawmut Avenue in Boston's South End in the early morning hours of July 16, 2012. The indictments also allege 3 counts of armed assault with intent to murder and 1 count of assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon. These indictments reflect shots fired at 3 surviving victims who were in the automobile with Mr. Abreu and Mr. Furtado at the time of the homicides. Those victims are 1 man who was struck but not killed and 2 other men who escaped physical injury. The indictments further charge Aaron Hernandez with unlawfully carrying a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver he used in the attack. Finally, the grand jury has also returned an additional indictment charging Tanya Singleton, Hernandez's cousin, with criminal contempt of court. Their arraignments in the Suffolk Superior Court have not been scheduled, but we expect that they will take place sometime in the very near future. I am joined this morning by Boston Police Commissioner William Evans, Superintendent Kevin Buckley, Lieutenant Detective Greg Long, and the Homicide Squad of Sergeant Detective Mark Sullivan and Detectives Josh Cummings, Paul McIsaac, and Dave Monroe. I'm also joined by First Assistant District Attorney Patrick Hagan, Assistant District Attorney Teresa Anderson of our Appellate Division, Assistant District Attorney Edmund Zabin, of the Chief of our Homicide Unit. Today's indictments represent nearly 2 years of investigation by these police and prosecutors and others in Boston and beyond. They're the result of testimony from more than 24 witnesses and over 80 exhibits presented to the grand jury starting on July 17, 2012 and continuing through to this morning. The transcript of the grand jury investigation is over 1,200 pages. As you know, Mr. Hernandez is currently facing charges in connection with another homicide. While we have a duty to inform the public, and in particular the victims and their families, about these charges, we also have an obligation to our counterparts in Bristol County not to make any statements that could compromise their prosecution. We have a similar obligation to protect the defendant's right to a fair trial, not just in our case, but also in the Bristol County case, where he will likely be tried first. For these reasons, we must be limited in the information that we release to the public outside of a court proceeding. I've discussed these limitations with Commissioner Evans, and he agrees with me. We're both aware of the heightened public interest in this case, but we have to balance that interest with our ethical responsibilities to the Commonwealth's cases and the defendant's rights. With that caveat, I'll offer a brief summary of the allegations. But first, I want to make something very clear about the victims in this case. On the morning that Daniel Abreu and Safiro Furtado were killed, they were described in media reports as being tied to a Cape Verdean gang based in Dorchester. Nothing could be further from the truth. Neither of them were involved in gangs, guns, or violent crime of any kind, and that characterization was unfair to their memory and their families. We have only the deepest sympathy for them and for their ordeals. At about 12:30 a.m. on July 16, 2012, the victims arrived at the Cure Lounge on Tremont Street in Boston's Theater District. By coincidence, Aaron Hernandez and another individual entered the club at the same time. Our investigation has not uncovered any evidence that these several individuals were known to each other, but their chance encounter inside the club triggered a series of events that culminated in these murders. After the victims left the club at approximately 2 a.m., they drove down Tremont Street. Unbeknownst to them, Hernandez followed behind, traveling in an SUV. When the victim's car stopped at a red light on Shawmut Ave, waiting to turn onto Herald Street, the SUV pulled up beside the victim's car on the right. Aaron Hernandez then fired a .38 caliber revolver multiple times from the driver's side of his vehicle into the passenger side of the victim's vehicle. Daniel de Abreu, who was the driver, suffered multiple wounds, including a fatal gunshot wound to the chest. Safiro Furtado, who was in the front passenger seat, also suffered multiple wounds, including a fatal gunshot wound to the head. 2 backseat passengers escaped physical injury and fled on foot. The third man remained in the vehicle with his friends and suffered a gunshot wound to his arm. From last June forward, there were a number of significant developments in this investigation. Those developments include the recovery of the car Hernandez used during the murders, and which he later hid in a relative's garage in Bristol, Connecticut, and the recovery of the murder weapon from an individual with ties to Hernandez. I expect more information will be forthcoming at the arraignment, but at this stage of the case, the return of the indictments, there are limitations to the information that I can provide. As to the indictment returned against Hernandez's cousin, Tanya Singleton, she was subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury investigating these murders. She was granted an order of immunity to provide certain information regarding the SUV used in those murders without exposing herself to criminal prosecution. But instead, on September 13, 2013, she refused to testify. The depth and breadth of our investigation speaks to the professionalism of our trial and investigative team. First Assistant DA Pat Hagan, who led the investigation for our office, and Appellate ADA Teresa Anderson, who assisted him. I would also like to commend Sergeant Detective Mark Sullivan and his squad. They proved their commitment to this case long before it attracted national attention. The outstanding work they did collecting, preserving, and analyzing the evidence in those critical first few days contributed directly to the extensive progress we've made in the grand jury over the past year. I would also like to thank the Massachusetts State Police, the North Attleboro Police, the Bristol and Hampden County District Attorney's Offices, the Bristol County State Police Detective Unit, and police and prosecutors in Hartford and Bristol, Connecticut, and the United States Marshal Service for their assistance in the course of this investigation. For us, this case was never about Aaron Hernandez. This case was about 2 victims who were stalked, ambushed, and senselessly murdered on the streets of the city they called home. I assigned this case to First Assistant DA Pat Hagan on the very morning of these murders, not because we knew where the evidence would take us, but because it was a brutal double homicide with few leads and well suited to his strengths as a prosecutor. ADA Anderson responded to the corner of Shawmut Avenue and Herald Street alongside Sergeant Detective Sullivan and his squad that early morning, and she has been involved with this case since that time. Again, not because of who the defendant turned out to be, but because the victims and their families deserved our very best efforts from day one. No matter who the victim or the defendant might be, every murder in Boston gets the very best investigators and the most experienced prosecutors. Again, I know that you have many questions, probably very detailed and fact-specific questions that we simply cannot ethically answer at this stage of the process. In a week or so, when the man who pulled the trigger at the corner of Shawmut Avenue and Herald Street is arraigned in the Suffolk Superior Court, I expect that you'll hear much more about the facts and the circumstances of this case. But for the moment, I must ask for your patience as we proceed carefully and methodically, as we have since that terrible morning in July of 2012.